Welcome back to the second part of this episode on Chinese history and the rich history of Calgary's Chinatown.
Our guest is Dale Lee Kwong, a third-generation Chinese Calgarian, as well as a poet, playwright, and essayist.
You mentioned Canton Block a couple of times throughout our conversation. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of that building and its importance to Chinatown?
Oh, it was like the anchor. It was the first start of the third Chinatown. And I mean, now it's this building that's being revived. I had a chance, in fact, to go to the basement of one business. It came up in my Facebook memories the other day. I think it was 7 years ago. I went into the basement and there were newspapers from like 1918 glued to the wall as kind of makeshift insulation. Yeah. I mean, that is totally fascinating to me. I wish people could see that. But it was the starting point, and it gave the Chinese a safe place to anchor, and it housed associations. So the businesses were on the main floor, and as many businesses in Chinatown, even now when you walk around, you'll see on the main floor a business. If you look to the second floor, there are rooms on top. What are those rooms? Those were rooming houses in the old days, like during the Exclusion Act era. And there were these beds. They were called a warm bed. You could rent a warm bed for 8 hours. And so there were 3 shifts of 8 men who would sleep in the same bed. The bed would still be warm from the person before you. I don't know where they kept their belongings, but the Canton Block was all like residential, I guess you would call it, upstairs at that time. The Chinese National League, which currently, their current building is on 3rd Avenue Southeast, and it's actually a vintage shop. You can go in it. It's called Boo Vintage Shop, and they have a little paragraph written up about it. That actually served the community by providing a mailing address. So some Chinese would go out to rural Alberta and they'd work somewhere, on a contract or a temporary job, and then they would get to another small town and work somewhere else. In order to stay in touch with their family, they would use the Chinese National League address, who then would have been, updated on where this person was, and then forward that person's mail to their last known address. I mean, these are little details that I only discovered myself in the last couple of years. I certainly don't expect Canadians to know this, but these are some of the hardships that were created by the legislation, and these men, with nothing to do but make money, and they would work and work and work, and they were 6 days a week, and they were not 8-hour days. They were much longer. Mm-hmm. If you go to the tunnel tours in Moose Jaw, which has tours of the Chinese laundries, right, they talk about people who didn't see sunshine except for once a year, the one day a year. And I don't know what day it was. It was either Christmas Day or New Year's Day. Like, can you imagine that? And so, yeah, they gambled, they drank, they took drugs. There were Chinese whores, and there was a little bit of rape culture, and there was created intergenerational trauma from that. And so, yeah, like in understanding Chinatowns and their purpose and how they segregated and how those patterns and problems of the community perpetuated, that this is all part of that. So tracing it back to the origins, I think, is important.
Thinking about kind of what Chinatowns are today, though, they've obviously changed a lot as more immigration has happened from China after the Exclusion Act was finally repealed. So what kind of place does Chinatown hold for Chinese Canadians in Calgary now?
Well, I will mention that the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in 1947. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that on January 1st the next year, suddenly everything was open. I mean, right, it took years for things to reverse and also for people to save enough money to bring their families over.
Of course, yeah.
And yeah, so now as far as Chinatowns today, you know, part of the struggle of Chinatown is parking. People have stores in the suburbs, you know, in Calgary, there's T&T in several locations. You don't have to pay for parking. You can go and buy your Chinese groceries anywhere. You can get it at Superstore. And so coming to Chinatown, some people view as a hassle. What is the benefit of coming to Chinatown? For me, it's the impact of being surrounded by all Chinese people. There's Chinese businesses, Chinese residents, Chinese culture, all in one place. And the history, of course, is there. And the seniors are there right now. And so at the Chinese Cultural Center, for example, there is a museum in the basement, and it displays the history of China, which is important. But to me, the most important thing is a small little room they have, which is about the size of the railroad cafe that you guys have in that that front section of Heritage Park. It's quite small, but it's dedicated to the history of Calgary's 3 Chinatowns and the history of Chinese Canadians in general. They have artifacts there and archival photos where you can actually see some of the buildings still exist. And I believe, Kesia, you said that someone, Sarah at Heritage Park, is working on overlays on some of those photos.
Yeah, hoping to, yeah.
Yeah, past and present together. Like I can recognize it sometimes when I look at the photos, but there was a style, like that idea of the business on the main floor and then living on top. So there's a building, if you're familiar with the old Jade Palace restaurant, which was the first upscale Chinese restaurant in Calgary. That building, the Jade Palace, and next to it was Jade Palace International, which was a store. And just behind there, you'll see on the second story, the Wong Affinity Association, and there's rooftops there. So if you stand on Center Street across from those buildings and look directly across, you can see there's a new facade in the front, but evidence of the second story, there's a name for it, and it was a triangular shape on the top of the building, and it was from Roman architecture.
Oh, neat.
And it gave it a presence of sort of nobility, and it made it just look more dignified. It was a way of taking two, sort of a duplex, and putting this triangular dome that gave it more regality. And so, yeah, in Chinatown, there's multiple organizations of like, so the associations in Chinatown, there's different types. So one is based on the region you're from. So for example, my family is from the Guangzhou region, which was Canton and the reason why, well, there's so many things to explain, but in Romanization of the Chinese language, first there was something called Wade Giles. So Canton was called Canton, but then when they switched to Pinyin, which is the Romanization of Mandarin, Canton became Guangzhou. And so that's where it gets a little complicated. And so the old stuff is still in the old Wade Giles names, but then people refer to them sometimes in the new names, and it gets very confusing. But you might have an organization based on the village area, or a family name. So I'm not actually a Kwong, which is a whole nother story, but my real surname is Ng. And so like the Ng Association, if I were a Chinese bachelor and I came to Calgary, I would go to the Ng Association or my county association, and they would have helped me with accommodation, food, employment, acclimatizing to Calgary and getting on my feet. And then later, there also formed interest groups, so like, you know, music associations or martial arts or things like that. And then there was a fourth one. There were these secret societies. I don't actually know what they were about. It has to do with the political movements going on in China at the time. People probably don't know Sun Yat-sen, who's considered the founder of modern China, came to Calgary in 1912, I believe it was, and he had a fundraising dinner held in the Canton Block.
So Dale, what is like one thing that you'd love to see Heritage Park do going forward to involve more Chinese Canadian history on park?
Recognizing the Chinese Exclusion Act in 2023 is a huge thing. It's the 100-year anniversary of the Exclusion Act, of when it first started, 1923. And so 100 years of discrimination, basically. And I have also been in talks with another manager at Heritage Park about ways we could present that history in theatrical form, because I am a playwright. And so we're looking at possibly street scenes or something at the Canmore Opera House, or interpreter guides who might be at the Club Cafe to answer questions, or at the laundromat to really engage Calgarians about Chinese Canadian history.
Mm-hmm. There's nothing but opportunity for us to keep working on things.
Yeah, there's a ton of different things there. Dale, you talk about this stuff a lot, work with people on this kind of thing. What's one of the things, or some of the things, that you wish that people knew about Chinatowns, and especially Calgary's Chinatown?
Well, I will say, you don't know what you don't know. Even I don't know what I don't know. We're all on a journey. I'm learning things about Black culture, Black history, Black Lives Matter, Indigenous culture, every child matters. And so you don't know Chinese Canadian history. And you probably don't know that in 1892, the smallpox riot was the result of angry, drunk white people, 300, who descended on Chinatown at that time, Chinatown #1, set fires, vandalized, looted, harmed 2 people. I don't know what happened to those 2 people. That's all the research said. 2 people were injured. Like, I don't know how dangerously they were injured. The authorities were called and did not show up. The RCMP finally showed up and escorted every Chinese citizen to the barracks, where they had to live for 3 weeks while things settled down, because the Chinese were blamed for bringing smallpox to Calgary. Just like, bird flu and COVID and those things. Like, anti-Asian hate is ongoing. Every generation of Chinese has encountered discussions with City Hall. I'm fortunate because currently City Hall is trying to rectify some of the mistakes of the past. But when I mentioned the Canton Block in 1912 being established, I forgot to mention what probably expedited that whole looking for somewhere to go was a huge fire, 1912, in the second Chinatown. Now, throughout North America in 1910 to 1912 are records of arsons in Chinatowns. Now, the one in Calgary was never labeled an arson, but who's to say that it was not, and that was covered up or not known or discovered? And then, the thing that happened with City Hall trying to put the 8-lane east-west penetrator through. So now, for the past 2 years, I've been on the advisory council for the Tomorrow's Chinatown group, which in December is taking forth a new area redevelopment plan to council. In conjunction with that, the city of Calgary, hats off to them, created something called a cultural plan. It's the first time this has been done, and it's to work hand in hand with the area redevelopment plan, and it's to give the Chinese community opportunities to share these stories. And so I have several projects actually that I'm going to be applying for funding to bring to life these stories from Chinese history, Chinese Canadian history. When you're in Chinatown and looking for a parking space and some little old lady is walking across the street just shuffling. I mean, I drive through Chinatown several times a week. So I know part of me is like, oh, come on, hurry up, little old lady. But then another part of me is like, oh my God, if I knew that lady's story, I feel ashamed of myself. Like, she's older than she looks. So if she looks 80, she's probably 95. You know what I mean? And there are many residents over 100. And so I would invite your listeners, since they're already listening to a podcast, the next time you want to listen to another podcast, go to Jupiter Theatre, which is a Calgary theater company. Through them, at the beginning of the pandemic, I created a fictionalized story of the history of Calgary's Chinatown. It's called Master Ugam's Blessing. And in that, the Center Street Bridge actually is a metaphor for the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so in the story, no one was allowed to cross the bridge for 23 years. And someone heard or read the story and they said to me, is that true about the Center Street Bridge? And I'm like, no, it's a metaphor, but Mike Tan and myself performed in this thing. I'm not really a performer, so they actually got a 2-for-1. I wrote it and I performed for free, and it was directed by Chantal Han, who's Korean, Filipino. She directed it, and so 3 Asian artists and Jupiter Theatre put this podcast together. And I think it's a great learning tool, and it can be used either as just a story you can listen to, but it's actually a walking tour, which has to be partially because of the construction in Chinatown. You can't follow the exact route, but you'll get the gist of where to walk.
So Dale, to finish off here, what if people want to go out and learn more about Calgary's Chinatown, what are some of the ways that they can go do so?
There's a display called Our Chosen Land in the basement of the Chinese Cultural Center. You can tour it on your own, or you can arrange group tours for $5 per person in the group. And it's open whenever the Cultural Center is open. So I don't know the exact hours. There is the podcast, walking tour podcast, Master Ugam's Blessing, at the Jupiter Theatre website and wherever you get your podcasts. And every summer there's an event called Historical Week, run by Chinook Historical something Society.
Yep.
CHHS.
Chinook County Historical Society.
Thank you.
Yep.
And they have, it's a volunteer thing, and there's usually at least 1 or 2 tours of Chinatown. This past summer, they actually had a tour of the Chinese cemetery. And it was led and researched by a white person who I felt really bad for her because there were mostly a Chinese audience there. And so when she did the little section on Chinese history, I was there like adding and correcting some of her facts. But they said no one had come forward to present that. And so they took it upon themselves to do that. Since then, I've actually found someone who's interested in doing that. So I'm hoping to connect those 2 people. And also, every May is what called Jane's Walk, run by Calgary Foundation. And before the pandemic, every Friday, so Jane's Walk is the first weekend of May. So on the Friday of that, whatever week it is, I would always do a walking tour and conclude it with a Chinese banquet, a 10-course banquet.
Wow.
I did not do that last year. I actually did a tour for oh my goodness, it just slipped my mind. It's a National Historic organization. Kirsten Eveden, formerly from Lockheed House,
right,
the head of that, the development officer there. Anyways, I did a walking tour in July for that group. So if you keep your eyes open, there are lots of opportunities. I have a Chinatown walking tour booklet, which is available at Shelf Life Books, Boo Vintage Shop, and the Chinese Cultural Center. It's $10. It was first written for Loft 112, which is a creative space in East Village. And it's kind of a weird walking tour in that it's my personal memories. And I also flag photo ops. So every section will have, hey, here's a good spot to take a photo. And so there's like this brick archway that enters Sinlock Park on the south side. If you stand on one side of it, it actually frames the Canton block so wonderfully. And then if you stand in front of it, you get the nice archway with the Chinese words Calgary Chinatown Park, and the seniors building is behind it. So that is another opportunity you could do. There's a lot of opportunities to learn more about Chinese culture in Calgary.
That's awesome. We hope that people will take us up on that opportunity to come and see us. Dale, it's been fantastic. Learned a lot today, and we hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for what Heritage Park is doing to increase the diversity and inclusion at the park.
Thanks, Dale.